We're here with the breaking news that Russia has just attacked the city of Odessa in Ukraine, where President Zelenskyy was hosting the Prime Minister of Greece, where bombs went off just 500 meters away from their meeting. Now, the Greek Prime Minister and President Zelenskyy just held a joint news conference where they said, quote, "We heard the sound of sirens and explosions that took place near us. We did not have time to get to a shelter. It is a very intense experience." I'm here with the executive director of the Hellenic American Leadership Council, who's been in touch with the Greek Foreign Ministry, Endy Zemenides. Endy, what can you tell us about this? And is this a major escalation in the war with Ukraine?
It is absolutely a major escalation by Russia. This is not only a continuing of its war of aggression. This is not a civil war. This is a war of aggression. And they are bombing Ukrainian cities every day. But they bombed a NATO and EU prime minister. And they knew he was going to be there. And people can say, oh, nobody knew he was going to be there or so on. This was a very public trip. And I think it was a signal to the United States because Secretary Blinken actually spoke with Prime Minister Mitsotakis yesterday. There are discussions, and Greece has been steadfast in support of Ukraine from day one, transferring weapons, housing refugees. Odessa has a special place in Greek history. In fact, that's where the Greek diaspora in the 1800s helped launch the Greek War of Independence against the Ottoman Empire. And when Prime Minister Mitsotakis was invited by Congress 2 years ago to deliver an address to a joint session of Congress, he said, "Hey, we feel this issue. We know what it means to be invaded and occupied because that's what happened in Cyprus." And this July, the Turkish invasion of Cyprus is going to be 50 years old, and I'm sure Russia would like to do the same to Ukraine. But this is a major escalation, a very dangerous one.
So where do we go from here? What does this mean with the war between Ukraine and Russia? Does this mean that Europe gets more engaged? What does this mean for NATO? Is this potentially a response to the countries that are about to enter NATO? What do you make of all this?
Well, Europe has been getting more engaged. While we've been paralyzed here, we're actually seeing Europe stepping up. And we're going to see by the next NATO summit, this upcoming NATO summit in Washington, that Europe is increasing, right? I'm sure Trump world would love to take the credit for it, but this has been a long time request of successive U.S. administrations. The Europe hit its 2% goal in defense spending. Greece has actually been one of the countries that consistently hits that 2% goal. And that's why it would be especially important to stand by Greece here. Greece has met its commitments as a NATO member, has helped Ukraine. In fact, the northern Greek base of Alexandroupolis, if it wasn't for Greece being able or for the West to land weapons in Alexandroupolis, truck them up to Ukraine, this war would be much different. But I also think that Putin's trying to send a signal, and seeing the paralysis in our Congress and trying to change some facts on the ground, trying to dissuade Europe from stepping in, even in the short term, in U.S. shoes, and counting on very unproductive, destructive messages like the one that J.D. Vance said when he went to the Munich Security Conference, and let's just do a deal with Russia. You let Russia win here, there is nobody, not China with Taiwan, not anybody who's not going to see this as a green light. And if we've learned anything since September 11th, there is no such thing as over there. We're seeing the Houthis delay our shipping. If the Taiwan Straits get closed, if the South China Sea, if China thinks that it can have open season there, do whatever it wants, we'll see life get more expensive here. Whatever happens over there does affect us over here. And when we have allies that are willing to stand by our side, we cannot be abandoning them.
Now, you just mentioned J.D. Vance, who's been a pretty outspoken critic of funding Ukraine. Now, you sit on the board of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. What do Republican attitudes on Ukraine, largely fueled by the former president and his views on Russia, what do Republican attitudes towards funding Ukraine mean for the war in Ukraine, and what are some of the big picture ramifications for those attitudes?
So the council does, one of its signature products is this. It's the only public policy polling consistently on American attitudes on foreign policy. The shift in Republican attitudes is amazing. And actually, the exclamation mark, we've seen it with Mitch McConnell stepping down. The strong national defense Reaganite identity is gone. If someone even 10 years ago told me that there would be any part of the Republican Party that views Vladimir Putin favorably, we would have called them crazy. Now we've seen Tucker Carlson, we've seen J.D. Vance saying, let's just negotiate them. And I don't know where this Republican Party is going in terms of real foreign policy identity. Even in President Trump's, the former President Trump, in his first term, there was a national security strategy that said, we're going to focus on great power competition. Well, if you're going to focus on great power competition, and this goes to those who are holding up aid, for a minuscule amount of the U.S. defense budget, roughly 10%, you have done irreparable harm to the Russian defense industry and the Russian military. This is probably the best bang for buck, and you have not, unlike the forever wars, you have not had to risk American lives. You have not blood. So the question is, for the J.D. Vances of the world, is, well, how do you want to show leadership? And going back to your question about Europe before, Europe is starting to create, not only with spending, but with cooperation. We're seeing operations in the Red Sea now against the Houthis, a separate defense identity. Some people may applaud that, say, take some of the burden away from the United States. I agree, take some of the burden away from the United States, but do it in an alliance that includes the United States. If anybody, Republican or Democrat, thinks it's better for Europe to act completely separate and apart and not coordinated with the United States, that person does not want to lead. That's a worst deal ever. And that's not America first. That's America alone.
So, yeah, you always hear the America First crowd say, why are we sending our money overseas? This is about America first. This has nothing to do with us. How is American national security and American interests implicated in this war in Ukraine?
Look, the American leadership and America's alliances from the end of World War II to today, we have avoided any major power wars, any major power confrontations. We have not had a World War III. If you look at what great powers went for the 100 years before those alliances and before American leadership, you had great power war after great power war. You not only had World War I and World War II, you had 100 years worth of war in Europe. You had Japan and China going to war. You had Balkan wars. There was nothing but wars. The post-World War II world order has been the most successful in terms of keeping peace and keeping us out of world wars. That doesn't mean that every investment is perfect. That doesn't mean there hasn't been waste. That doesn't mean that there have not been bad bets. But we have not seen world wars. And if anybody is telling you, hey, if we just stay within our borders, China's not going to do anything, Russia's not going to do anything, they're not living in reality. So what we need to do is, how do we adjust? How do we do fair burden sharing? How do we make allies step up? But when allies step up, when Kurds fought ISIS in Syria so we didn't have to fight them elsewhere, we should not have been abandoning the Kurds. When the Ukrainians, in Europe, they criticize America, that America is willing to fight to the last Ukrainian. Well, if the Ukrainians are willing to fight, why aren't we helping them? So when we have allies, Ukraine, the Kurds, the Greeks, that are willing to stand up for our interests, and they're saving American lives that way, because then the fight doesn't come to our borders or doesn't come to our bases.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's
and by the way, it goes to our economy too, right? If the Greeks are sending ships to the Red Sea, if the Houthis are able to shut down the Red Sea and slow down the Suez Canal, or even block the Suez Canal. Let's remember during COVID when we didn't have products on our shelf and everybody said, oh, because one ship got stuck in the Suez Canal. Now imagine all those ships are sailing around the Horn of Africa or somewhere else. So what happens over there affects us over here. But most importantly, this has been the most successful security alliance of all time. It has kept us out of world wars. We can make it better. The whole American experience, it's at the very beginning of our Constitution, to form a more perfect union. We can make things more perfect. They're not perfect, but getting rid of them puts us in a world of anarchy. And for anybody's political philosophy, this is why we have the Leviathan. Nobody wants to go back to anarchy, and we're not set up well for a world in anarchy.
Now, final question. Do you think if the Republicans win in November, if the former president wins, that they will do what they can to either withdraw from NATO or not fulfill our commitments?
Yeah, I think the president is guided by a transactionalism that's going to undermine the trust. Even if he doesn't withdraw from NATO, just putting a doubt whether America will stand up. That comment that he made recently, that I'll let Putin do whatever he wants to somebody who hasn't made 2%, it was one of the most destructive and diplomatically obtuse, dumb statements you could make. You don't need to fully withdraw from NATO to undermine the confidence in NATO. A lot of these, when allies know they're standing with each other, they'll take risks. And again, this is why today is important. Greece has kept its commitments to NATO. So are you going to stand up? This is one where not only the U.S., the Biden administration should be talking about what happened today, but every candidate, including Donald Trump and including Senate candidates and including people who go to the Munich Security Conference like J.D. Vance, should be standing up and condemning what happened today, because this is an ally who met its 2%, who is buying American weapons, who is complying with the sanctions that America asked it to comply with, which is housing U.S. troops, which is giving expanded basing rights to the U.S. And if you don't show that you're going to stand faithfully with that ally, well, then who are you?
Well said. Well said. Well, Endy Zemenides joining us as the executive director of the Hellenic American Leadership Council, with the news that as Prime Minister Mitsotakis from Greece was visiting President Zelenskyy in Ukraine today, Russia bombed just 500 meters from their convoy. Endy, we'd love to have you back on to keep you in the breast of things as these things develop. Thanks so much for joining us.
Anytime. Thanks, Justin.